thank you everyone for joining us today. Particular thanks to our panelists who are from abroad who are calling in late at night to help us out with this session. Let me add just a couple of things about some of our panelists tonight. Extraordinarily impressive. Greg is the CEO of HighQuest, as just mentioned, but he's also a graduate of West Point, and he has the wonderful distinction of having sponsored many conferences on global agriculture for many years, including a section on women in agriculture. We'll get to that a little bit later. And coming up in just a few days, October 20th, 21st, here in Tokyo, physical presence here in Tokyo, Greg will be leading a global agricultural investing conference at the Tokyo American Club. So if you're interested, check out his website and come join us at that event. Greg, thank you so much for joining us. Keiko Honda, as you know, is a professor, as just mentioned, but she's also the former head of MIGA, the World Bank's section that deals with risk around the world, an immense career. She's also my boss because she's a member of the board of directors of MUFG, Holdings, okay? And another MUFG person, my colleague, Haruka-san here, Miyake-san, who's our food analyst for Japan. We've done some sessions together, and she's very insightful about how the market structure in the agricultural supply chain impacts the food security issues. So again, let me thank everyone for joining us today at this session. We'll start off with about 5 minutes each of just commentary. How do you think about the global food security issue? And then 5 minutes each from there. Then I'll talk a little bit about supply constraints, labor, land, et cetera, regional disparities, women in agriculture, and then some distribution constraints. And then I want to end up with some exciting technologies. If there is a solution to this problem of global food shortage, particularly with population growth, lots of supply disruptions, it will be in new technologies. These are competing against each other. And I'm sure we'll have some very interesting give and take on some of these cool new technologies and whether they will make any difference at all. So with that quick introduction, let me start off asking Greg for his view of the world of agriculture and food security.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you. Thanks so much for the invitation to join this G1 Global Conference. So I'd like to start in just saying that there's a lot of groups that would say that Japan's internal food production capabilities, do not add up to being food secure on the surface. But at the same time, the list of countries that are food secure from strictly domestic production is actually fairly limited. You would include in that group US, Canada, Argentina, France, Australia, New Zealand, Ireland, and only a few others. Most notably, the most food secure countries tend to be in a position to generate and export surpluses. Okay, so and those ones that I listed are certainly in that category. Some of the characteristics I think we need to acknowledge for food security: the sufficient amounts of high quality and fertile farmland, multiple favorable climatic zones, efficient and modern transportation, processing, and storage systems, access to inputs, seeds and fertilizers, favorable demographics, okay, and availability of labor, something that people take for granted, access to technology, capital, and energy, and also legal structures that permit the consolidation and scale of farming operations. So these ingredients are major ones if one wishes to produce all of its food domestically with minimal external supply chain risks. Globally, we see trends in the ability of countries to be food secure. Scale. The average farm size, it's my understanding, outside of Hokkaido in Japan is 2.1 hectares per farm. This compares to 180 hectares per farm in the United States and over 200 in Brazil and Argentina. Another trend is the emergence since roughly 2009 of farmland funds or asset management groups that number today over 400 around the world. And the assets under management that these represent is in excess of 150 billion US dollars. It also comprises over 40 million hectares of farmland. In Japan, there are only a few institutionally backed agricultural funds. One of them is Japan Strategic Capital, which is largely a VC fund, and then a brand new startup, I think, which is backed by Norinchukin, Nihon Agri. So the list is very, very short in Japan in terms of these mega-sized operations that are supporting much enhanced productivity around the world. So another issue is just the requirements for crop inputs, okay? The fertilizers, chemicals, seeds, et cetera. Many of these are coming from very risky places, Russia, Ukraine, and even China. Also just locations that are prone to shutting off some of the exports of some key inputs. The farming population, while everyone acknowledges in Japan is shrinking and the average age of the farmer is growing older rapidly. So it's the same thing in the United States. I mean, people don't even realize that, but we also have average age of US farmers close to 60 years old. However, 60% of all US agricultural output is produced from just 2% of our farms. So this speaks to the fact that there are extremely large scale operations, not just in the United States, but in other of these food secure locations with surpluses. So it's the ability to spread the costs of the inputs, the technology, and the mechanization. And many of these operations are more than 10,000 hectares in size. So just in terms of other comments about what it takes to be food secure, while domestic production for the vast majority of Japan's food needs is probably unrealistic, Japan has many strengths which can be considered, which allows it to be food secure with Japanese characteristics. I would like to point out that just the import, transportation, logistics, alliances, and financing reach are impressive. For many, many years, we've been following the 6 largest Sogo Shosha companies. So Mitsui, Mitsubishi, Itochu, Marubeni, Sojitz, Toyota Chusho. Collectively, they own and operate hundreds of food, energy, fertilizer, and agricultural assets abroad, outside of Japan. These are crucial, not just for the reliability of supply chains to Japan, but also to literally dozens of major countries around the world. So, the Japanese trading houses, while originally set up really just to serve the procurement needs for Japan itself, truly function in a global way. And I believe that is a major asset that most people don't realize that Japan has. So I'll stop there, Robbie, but would love to hear my fellow panelists' views as well.
Thank you very much. Those are fascinating comments, particularly the notion that the U.S. is as old as it is in farmers. And then the availability of land. There are thousands of things there that I'm sure we can get back to. So thank you very much. Keiko, can I ask you to give your observations on food security, not just for Japan or the U.S., but for globally, given your MEGA background?
Well, Robbie, first of all, thank you very much for having me. And also, it's my honor and pleasure to join the panel. And please forgive me, I'm joining from New York, which is a little bit of a noisy with the ambulance outside. But I'm doing well. Well, as a former member of the MEGA, which support the private investors investing in developing country while mitigating the political risk, I have to agree with the panelists of the previous plenary panel saying that unfortunately world is shifting to more difficult place. Therefore, I have a concern about national security as well as the food security. I see one issue for the world. I think 3 small issues for Japan. For the one issue for the world is, as Greg mentioned, many countries, not only developed, but also developing countries, probably more developing countries, do not have the sustainable, and also affordable food supply. We really kind of needs to support them, but I think as Greg pointed out, we cannot really increase the farmland as of today. It takes like years to come. So therefore, we actually kind of need some of the food supplier, including Japanese trading company that Greg mentions, have to play a role. But then I think I just like to mention 3 issues because Japan is just one of them. I think why don't I just going to take the example of Japan, which I'm probably more familiar since I spent most of my adult career in Tokyo. 3 issues is number 1, Japan, I don't, it's unfortunately we don't produce enough food that we need. I think the second one is the the gap is not necessarily coming from the allied countries. I think third issue is the import cost will be increasing. And also sustainable supply is a little bit of questionable. Those are the things. But just let me say a little bit of more. Japan produces 67% of the food that we really need in the yen term, while only 37% in calories in 2020. This is actually according to the Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry, and Fisheries. I also like to point out only 6% of soybeans are produced in Japan, 16% of flour, as well as 53% of the meat. So it's actually quite low percentage of the important food are produced in Japan. And then when it comes to like food imports, 22% of food is coming from the US and 7% each from Canada and Thailand and 6% of Australia, which is good, but 11% is coming from China, 5% is from Brazil. We need to think about who will continue to be our ally in terms of national security and who may not be. I think this is very, very important. Then I think the last one, large part of the food imports are denominated in dollars, and some others in some non-yen currencies. But since yen has been unfortunately weakened quite a bit, I think it will be continuing to do so. Therefore, we really need to think about where the supply coming from. But I think all current supply chain is developed only focusing on the yen cost, but we also need to think about the sustainability. Current agricultural supply system was developed. Japan's current agricultural supply system was developed right after the World War II. Each farmer were given the land at that time, and in Nokia, the Japan Agricultural Corporation, which was started in the 1900s, but renewed in 1947 after the negotiation with GHQ. As a matter of fact, the Nokia, GHQ wanted to modernize it quite a bit. However, due to the tight food supply issue, GHQ compromised it quite a bit. So that compromised system we still kind of living with. Therefore, Nokia financed all small farmers to buy agri machinery. And although it is changing, I think this is Greg. I think I cannot really agree more. The large corporation have many constraints to engage agribusiness. I myself had an opportunity to support many Japanese trading company engaging in the agribusiness, working on a plantation. Plantations, sometimes people may feel a little bit of negative connotation. Having said that, it's not so bad, but just a large scale. But it comes with high labor productivity and high capital productivity agribusiness. So they have expertise. So therefore, I feel like why we cannot really leverage them, not only as a food supplier but also food producer. I think in 2020, average age of Japanese farmer was 68 years old. So I think this number may be increasing in this year. So therefore, I'm very optimistic. We may have a very great moment to renew or even restructure this agri system. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Something Greg mentioned about the international activity of large Japanese trading companies, et cetera. And then your mentioning of the plantation issue, Keiko, reminded me of the case of pineapples that you told me. Could you tell everybody about the wonderful pineapple story?
Oh, yes, of course. Itochu acquired a company called Dole, not entire, but I think, outside of the US business that they own right now, I think including its brand. And then one of the big products of Dole is pineapple. And a pineapple can be harvested very specific, the region just kind of along the equator range. And they had the largest plantations in Philippines. Having said that, due to the climate change, Philippines started having a little bit of problems, so they have to find some other locations, and they decided to set up a plantation in Sierra Leone in Francophone Africa, where we had a pleasure to support. And by the way, this one is doing very well.
Yes, that's a good point, because Japanese capital and information about the world was critical in ensuring a stable supply of pineapple. And since I love Hawaiian pizza, to me, that's important. Haruka, can you give us your view on food security?
Sure. Thank you very much for having me. It's my honor to be here as one of the panelists. I work as an equity analyst that covers the consumer staples industry at Morgan Stanley in Japan. So for me, and also for the food space, I specifically look more at the packaged food companies. But many of the key elements of food security is crucial topic for these companies as well. And needless to say, food companies' earnings trends depend on consumption that determine sales, and also input costs that really fluctuate the cost side. And basically input materials, labor, energy, all of these availability and prices really matter. So this is the angle that I have exposure to the food security topic on my day-to-day work. And needless to say, given that many commodities such as wheat and soya beans, and just to name a few, have been rallying, and commodity prices have been a huge headwind for many of the companies that I look at. And also, as Keiko-san also just mentioned earlier, that rapidly depreciating Japanese yen has added another burden to many companies. So two key areas of topics that often get discussed in the stock market are one, pricing, whether pricing can be taken, and two, cost reductions that can be done by packaged food companies. And we think many of these issues are directly linked to the upstream suppliers routing back to agriculture, and also downstream players like retailers and consumers. On the cost side first, given the size of input price inflation has been too large, it has really been difficult and impossible for the packaged food companies to absorb cost hikes on their own. And for non-input costs, they do, reduce costs here and there, but they've been reducing costs constantly historically, that I think the room for additional cost reductions in the drastic matters is really limited. From Japan's food security and self-sufficiency of farm goods perspective, encouraging greater domestic production of agricultural products could be key. But the selling prices of these products to users tend to be much higher compared to the imports of the dry crops that come into Japan. So I think that is something that needs to be cleared out when we explore the opportunities for the domestically grown crops to be enhanced in the production quantity. Utilization of technology and robotics is still a key for controlling costs for the entire supply chain, not just limited to agriculture, but also food, packaged food companies, and also distributing retailers and such. But also consumers need to be accepting of higher prices to some extent. So that always puts a little bit of burden. We talk a lot about ethical consumption and the focus on SDGs and such, but that also requires more CapEx to be implemented and potentially costs getting higher. So consumers also need to, basically be accepting to that, but that also depends on the wage increases and whether that's possible. On pricing, companies in the food space have been raising prices in the last 18 months or so, and some have raised prices more than once, some have taken pricing for the first time in decades. Persistent concern is whether Japanese consumers can keep up with the price hikes. Also difficulty in raising prices in the Japanese market was partially created by the existence of the large-scale retailers, in our view, that they were able to bargain the prices from food manufacturers, because the food production is more fragmented of an industry. And the food industry too had some fault in, I think, delaying the price hikes that comes more on the active levels, because they tended to focus more on the volume sales to continue growing earnings overall. So whether consumers can keep up with pricing really is a focus for me to watch going forward. And if they fail, then the volumes consumed could fall, or consumers would simply trade down to cheaper material and cheaper items available in the market. So I'll stop here for now.
Thanks very much. There are a number of very interesting things there, particularly the how the difference in the degree of monopoly at different stages of production impacts the final costs and final prices. Another issue is shrinkflation. That is, we're seeing the same price, but smaller and smaller amounts of food in the boxes. Another, of course, is just the attitude toward nutrition and being fat in different countries. I just came back from 2 weeks in the US, and I was once again astonished at, shall we say, the high average calorie intake of my countrymen. Japan doesn't have a lot of room to reduce calorie intake. There is in the US, so that might help the US get through some of this, maybe even make it a little bit more healthy as we go along. So let me move into a specific topic that I've asked our panelists to talk about, which is supply constraints, regional disparities. I think Greg mentioned the country, Argentina, as a country that has immense agricultural, surplus, very fertile, wonderful, and yet Argentina has had a number of food riots. There's been a lot of disruption. So what are the key issues right now, or the key vulnerabilities in different regions of the world? Land supply, everybody's got a labor supply problem, capital supply to get economies of scale, which everybody is focused on, energy supply. Could you have, say, a country like Argentina, hugely fertile, lots of great land, but if you can't get energy, you can't raise anything. Fertilizer supply. How do some of these supply issues impact even the short-term outlook for food security and the potential for food riots around the world? Maybe Keiko-san, could I start with you on that?
Sure. I think Greg probably knows a lot more than I do about the Argentina, but I think, the labor supply shortage exists every single major country, maybe except for the very few. So this going to be like a really the big problem. At the same time, when it comes to the Argentina, the capital is a problem. Argentina sovereign has been had fiscal issues for many years. The previous administrations had but promising progress. Having said that, of course, they lost the elections, so therefore IMF is actually kind of supporting them, but I'm not really sure how long it's going to be sustainable. So the capital constraints it's there. And at the same time, I think, Argentina is okay with it, but I think many countries facing is the water supply. I think one thing, Solobi, I just like to kind of add to you the rest of the issues. Unfortunately, I think I'm a very optimistic person. Having said that, when it comes to this one, I really have to kind of inform the water constraints does exist in many parts of the world, including in China. And that's one of the reasons China is buying a farmland in Africa. I think those things we need to think about it. Maybe I think I will shut up now.
Greg, any comments on this issue?
Yes, I mean, there's a number of factors here. One is, government made or man-made. When you see China shutting off its traditional exports of potassium, of potash, of calcium, critical inputs for the farming sector around Southeast Asia, for example, that's going to have an impact on supply and production in that region. Malaysia shut off the exports of palm oil early on in the whole Russia-Ukraine war. That caused an immediate jump in prices and really caused and actually could have caused some major societal disruptions because of the importance of veg oil with cooking needs. Keiko mentioned water. I mean, look at California. Look at Brazil. Right. I mean, the drought in Brazil, which is severely impacting the coffee crop. OK, we always take coffee for granted. It's always going to be there. But, you've got these man-made and, nature-based factors, which are not only real, but they just happen every single year. This year, it seems as though everything is happening at once. But, it's a major concern for the markets.
Is the energy intensity of agriculture going down or up? Greg?
That's a great question. There is no doubt that the energy requirements for modern agriculture are significant. If you look at indoor farming, I mean, people love vertical farming. I mean, Oishi in Japan, Spread in Japan, great examples of successful businesses, but they're highly reliant on proximity to very, very affordable power sources. Okay, so indoor agriculture, is the intensity of energy needs is quite high. But if you look at Ukraine, the combines, the tractors, the ability of these massive farms to be, to be collected with the combines, after during the harvest is severely impacted by fuel availability. Okay, so I mean, the reality is that we live in the 21st century. We have incredibly efficient and highly productive systems, but they are all reliant on readily available sources of energy.
Haruka, in the Japanese food supply chain, particularly in the industries you cover, is the energy efficiency improving?
I would say gradually, yes. Companies are very mindful of essentially all of the commodities and energy cost inflation. And every time that hits the world, companies come out of the peaks and say, look, even though the prices are pulling back, we think it's just temporary. Globally speaking, it's going to, all of the prices will continue to rise. So we need to really come up with solutions to control our costs. So for instance, like when they build out new plants, they would also set up like solar panels and also explore new systems to kind of like recycle the energies and also, increase the efficiency of water resources and such. So I think, it's making a gradual improvements.
This brings up a little model that I invented 20 some years ago, which is you never really see a huge change in energy usage or really anything else unless there is a crisis. I call this the CRIC cycle: crisis, response, improvement, and complacency. And we've been in a long period of complacency about agriculture supply. And my hope is that this crisis, first of all, doesn't get so bad. But if it does, that might be the huge opportunity for a lot of new firms to introduce a lot of new technology to push things to the next level. With that little editorial comment, let me switch to the next topic I want to talk about, which is women in agriculture. Greg, you have sponsored a number of conferences in this over the years to great acclamation. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the content of those conferences and how you see the role of women in agriculture evolving around the world.
Yeah, sure. First of all, from a food security perspective, women are unbelievably proficient, very, very reliable experts in the agricultural field. And about 11 years ago, there was broad recognition in the United States that the agricultural and food sectors were very male dominated. And CEOs that I was speaking with at some major companies, they expressed concern that for some reason, they were not able to attract enough of the great talent that was out there. And therefore, 50% of the marketplace was simply not being drawn into this vital sector. So we set out 11 years ago to change that, or to help change it. We launched Women in Agribusiness, and the whole purpose of it is to help provide the tools needed for women to not only succeed, but then to ultimately increase their representation across all fields of agriculture and food sectors. So it's been a long time program. As you mentioned, there's been a number of conferences in the United States and in Europe that we've been holding. We will have the first event in Japan next week. So on October 19th in Otemachi, we'll have a half-day seminar plus an evening reception. So if anyone's interested in this, go to womeninag.com and you'll see information about this program. But we see this as just being a vital piece of the solution for global food security, because women, as an unrepresented group in agriculture and food, have massive opportunities to provide their talents and their unique view on life and the role of food to our sector.
Thanks very much. In some Morgan Stanley research, we have documented that higher female participation in boardrooms, in middle management, has actually improved the profitability of companies. Is this true in agriculture as well, Greg?
There is broad recognition or consensus that diversity does improve profitability. It does improve performance, the team structures, the overall morale in a company. So, within the agricultural and food context, the 500 plus organizations that are part of Women in Agribusiness are truly committed to this. And I have a feeling that they're looking at their own company's performance as one of the drivers.
Haruka, in the companies that you cover, are you noticing that the companies with more women in management, more women on the board, are they doing better?
I'll be fair, right? Companies, female representations on the board or manager levels, even when I go and see them in person at meetings, I see more female speakers and also female representation in general. So I think this, pursuing the greater diversity and female encouragement and all of that, that is taking place. And also I look at the large corporations, so they, I think, are relatively more encouraged to commit to those diversity and inclusion type of engagements. However, it's difficult to split out the earnings performance into the contribution coming from diversity and the macro environment and companies' own self initiatives. So I would want to say yes, but I will need to do a little more work
Yeah,
on this.
don't have the call it numerical basis to say yes quite yet. Keiko-san, do you have any comments on this?
Well, my former employer, McKinsey, has a similar study that Morgan Stanley came up with. Higher women representation in a boardroom implies higher performance. Having said that, I have not really seen the food processor, nor the agribusiness yet, but I'm pretty sure I think it's in line with it.
I actually I came up with one example that one of our companies was presenting. This is a baking company. And there, the CEO was highlighting how some of the female employees came to the managers and said, look, our products are missing this and that. The competitor products value propositions are greater, and we can do this, these activities and whatnot. And they, at first, were skeptical whether that would work, but they actually developed some of the products that the female employee had came up with. And they also brought the female employee to the actual negotiations with retailers. And there, the retailers actually listened to the company's offerings more. And that actually resulted in enhancing the popular products for the company. So I think, it's more on the ground basis, but it's definitely making changes. And those success stories also make the mindsets of the management also change, that they should also listen to female employees more.
The best example I know of that is Aeon, the big retailer. And I met the CEO a few years ago, and he put out a diktat to the whole firm that there will not be any meetings unless there is at least one woman present. Half our consumers are women, so we're not going to have a meeting without a woman present. And so he imposed that on the firm. And according to him, at least, that had an immense impact on the way product development and marketing actually operated. So there is at least some evidence that even Japan is moving much more aggressively on that. We're a little bit short of time, so let me skip the distribution constraints element and move to exciting technologies. This is an area where it's very difficult to come out with a clear conclusion. Greg and I were talking a little bit earlier. I'm more on the sort of, it uses a lot of energy, but this, manufacturing stuff is good. And Greg's a little more skeptical because of the energy issues. But let me just quickly introduce one company that I ran into the other day. It's a Japanese company. It's a vertical farming company, and they admit that they use a lot of energy, but they have a new technology that uses, I think, 1/20th the amount of water. They have a growth cycle that is 2/7 of the length of others. I went and visited a facility, and it's a very different kind of vertical farm. Most vertical farms have shelves, and these guys were just, amazed that anybody would try to grow anything like that. What they've done is they've taken some real agronomists from Japanese universities, but these guys are involved in the MIT Media Lab agricultural initiative. So took some agronomists, took some AI and IT researchers, and then also took some Japanese production technology people. And they built a vertical farm that is not shelves, it's drawers. Each drawer is completely climate controlled, nutrition controlled, et cetera. And when I talked to these guys, they showed me some of their facilities. They're already growing soybeans and strawberries. They call it chic vegetables or chic products that you can kind of sell at a big premium to people in nice parts of town. So that's all nice. But what I asked them is, will you be able to grow rice and wheat? And what their head of technology told me is, we think within about a year, the answer is yes. But they do need to solve the energy problem. So what I want to ask our panelists, could you identify some really cool new technologies? Could be in fertilizer, could be drones, whatever. Some cool technologies that you think will change the face of agricultural production or distribution, but also will make the world a more secure place. Haruka, can you start?
Well, I think precision agriculture is definitely one area that's interesting globally. I understand that World Economic Forum has highlighted how if 15 to 20% of the global farmers engage in this activity, then the crop yielding could increase by 10 to 15%. So I think that's pretty interesting. In Japan, automation and data usage, I think, really matter. And automation also involves robotics. So even and that's for the agriculture as well as packaged food companies. There is one company that has fully automated by using robots, where their food production, they have one floor dedicated for raw materials unpacking, and they would bring in all of the inputs there, and robots just unpack everything and feed them into the plant lines and all of that. It's pretty I think it also enables the contamination risk to be minimized, which I think is pretty interesting.
It's great. Keiko, cool technologies.
Well, it's cool when I think this is the company that Greg mentioned before, a company called Oishi, which engages those vertical farming by setting up a plants near New York and LA to produce actually water cultivate production of sweet Japanese strawberries, which they are now selling in Whole Foods. Of course, this is not going to help probably the food security. However, that's one way to increase the entertaining relatively high-end users of strawberries. I think many of you in the room do know that differences between the regular American strawberries and Japanese strawberries are completely different things. And having said that, some of us have already experienced Japanese strawberries cannot live with the US berries, although it's a lot cheaper. So this is going on. By the way, I saw the exactly same thing is going on in Singapore this summer. So I think, this kind of things. So vertical farming, water culture, some of the relatively high-end things, also manufacturing nearby the big cities. I think that this trend will continue, but I admit that those things will consume energy.
Yeah, the point about where you locate the agriculture and the distribution costs are actually quite fascinating. I just read a book by Vaclav Smil, the scholar at University of Manitoba, and he had a little quiz in his book on energy and food. His quiz is, okay, which product uses more energy? What is it? Land to mouth. Okay, bread, chicken, or tomatoes? And the answer he gave was tomatoes, because they're mostly water and you have to take them a long way. The example he gave, this might have been a little bit, tendentious, but he said one of the biggest tomato farms in Europe is a huge facility outside, I think it's Barcelona. And if you actually calculate the total cost of moving the tomatoes from Barcelona to Stockholm, where they do sell them, you're talking about a lot of energy costs. So shouldn't we have, call it more distributed agriculture? That's another part of this whole technology. But let me ask Greg for the final word on cool new technologies. You've probably run into a lot of them.
I do. I mean, it's truly the golden age right now in so many areas of agriculture. I mean, basically 100% of all the areas that we see and we don't see related to agriculture is undergoing a renaissance of innovation. Two examples, one a little bit more mundane and the other one is a little bit more sex appeal. The mundane one, Bushel. So a company in the United States that within about a 3-year period has created an automated way for the farmer to interact with the co-op, which is where they would bring their crop. whether it's soybeans or corn. And before this, before bushel, it was all paper-based. The cash flows were very uneven. Paper invoices would be lost. So there was just an incredible amount of inefficiency, which allowed, which did not allow the farming families and companies to really, do more with less. Their productivity was really hit, their cash flow was hit, and Bushel has created a web-based device or app on the phone now to automate everything from the scheduling of the drop-offs to the weighing of it to the issuance of invoices, ultimately the payments. So it has become quickly a fintech company, in addition to a massive tool that all the major grain companies are using now to automate the whole process of getting these products to market. I think, and you may be surprised about this example, but because everyone thinks the U.S. is always so automated, but up until 3 years ago, it was highly paper dependent. So it's just very, very gratifying that we've seen that type of advance with Bushel. And then a little bit more sexy example is Dahlan Animal Health. So we all know that the honeybees around the world have been devastated by all kinds of diseases that affect the honeybees. And Dahlan has created a new technology to address foul brood disease in the hives, and they coat the queen that goes into the establishment of a new hive, and then every single offspring of this queen that's been treated is now immune from this devastating disease. So the problem is not solved yet in terms of the pollinator. The importance of the pollinator market or species to our survival, but this is one more step through technology that is allowing us to have more hope.
Great, that's wonderful. Do you believe these technologies will bring back the family farm?
It depends what your definition of the family farm is.
Okay.
I believe that every single farmer in the United States deserves to live at least a middle class, if not an affluent lifestyle. And in the United States, it's very, very difficult to achieve that if you're farming 10 acres or 20 acres. So automation and technology is in fact allowing farmers to do more with less, and therefore they can make do with with smaller scale farms. But in general, the U.S. farmers have to be business people, and they're amongst some of the best business people.
Okay, thanks very much. I think we can go into the Q&A session now. We've got about 10, 12 minutes for that. Perhaps we should start online. Are there any online questions? Okay, not yet. So here in the room, yes. Here's the.
Thank you. And I was listening, very interesting, your topic about the agricultural issues and topics. But since I belong to fish industry in Japan, if you have any knowledge about the fish industry, how to utilize the machines or how to be more effective, if you have those knowledge, can you share us, please?
Okay, Greg, could I put that one to you?
Sure. In a relatively short amount of time, the global fisheries industry has gone from just the catching with ships and nets and all that to more. I think it's 55% of the total fish protein consumed today is through aquaculture. So you have these sea pens, or you have these RAS systems which are on land with recirculating water. So, and these systems are unbelievably complex, high tech, and very efficient. So, I've seen the process from the little hatchling all the way through to when they're, cold. And just an example is just the lasers and the ability to estimate all the sizes of these fish when they actually get to the proper size. So, aquaculture is not only here to stay, but it's a major growth industry, and I think is a huge piece of global food security.
Yeah. This also raises a question of how much protein do we really need? It's call it an existential issue about, just what is nutrition? Okay. We always talk about food and food security, but at the end, it's really about nutrition. Should we be eating fish? Should we be eating pork, beef? Should we be eating insects? It's another issue about how you ensure proper nutrition given this huge change of conditions. So thanks very much for that question. By the way, on my flight to the US, I had codfish for the first time in years. It's delicious. I wish we had a little more. I wonder if it was farmed. So anyway, next question from here in the room. Anyone here? Yes, please.
Thank you very much for the wonderful panel sessions. My name is Uchiyama, CEO of Unary, and my question, I'm working with a lot of retail and food service industries, and they are very struggling with the price increase and the insufficient food supply. And my question, especially to Haruka-san, is that what kind of impact can be seen in the near future, especially on the retail and the food service industries, and what can they do? From your profession, thank you.
Well, the risks that I would see are, as I highlighted earlier, that consumers probably may not be able to keep up with the price hikes that are ongoing, not just limited to food, but anything across the board. And if that becomes more serious, then people could trade down to cheaper items or just even trade out of certain categories to cut down on volume consumption in general. So I think the first phase will be trading down to private labels or cheaper items, which might still help retailers, but that still, I think, impacts the manufacturers and wholesalers who aren't directly involved in the process. What could happen? And then the next step, if we start seeing volume declines, then the issue, I think the concern would be on the food producers side, whether they would need to come back and give more rebates to retailers and potentially lower the retail prices. So then the profitability levels would get impacted negatively for the food producers. But I guess at one point, if we go into a negative environment in general, then everybody probably needs to feel a pinch here and there. So, but if we can have better visibility for when the costs will peak out, when the price hike rounds would finish, then I think consumer sentiment might still hold up because they know when that will end. So right now, with lack of visibility for the inflation cycle, I think that's also making a lot of people more concerned. I'm not sure if
if I can throw a similar question to our two panelists online. Price hikes in the US have been very, very large. They're very visible. Are you noticing any changes in the way people consume, any changes in nutritional content? Or more particularly, will this upward shift of food prices, relative food prices, will it result in an improvement of health in the US? I ask this because one of my high school friends grew up to be a professor of clinical psychology, and she wrote a book called Wasteland, and in the sense of your waste gets bigger and bigger. One of the impacts of this immensely productive agriculture has been food got really, really cheap, and so people ate too much. So will this sort of reversal of cheap food actually improve health outcomes? So let me throw that to you, Keiko.
Well, I think unfortunately, short answer, probably not. The reason is lower income household in the at least in the United States, consume more junk foods, higher calorie, relatively limited nutrition. And I think, therefore, I think, one stat surprised me is average weight of women in these days is the close to the average weight of men of the United States in 1950s. So, of course, men is getting bigger, but women is also bigger too. this actually relatively big portion of this upward trajectory of people's weight are coming from lower income household.
So more expensive food might just push them to the wall without any benefits. That's your worry, okay?
That's my worry. I think that's definitely kind of going into the direction that we like last several months.
Yeah. Greg, do you have any observations on this?
Yeah, it's been very painful here. The U.S. Is unaccustomed to this type of food inflation and it becoming a much larger piece of the household budget. Of course, the most vulnerable segments of our society are hit the worst. And there's a terrible saying right now: is it going to be heat or eat coming into the winter season? Which is really a unimaginable thing to think about here, at least in the United States historically. I think that we see people going towards less expensive, for example, proteins. So people are more cost conscious. At Market Basket, for example, the price of pork is probably at least half, if not even 70% less than steak. So people are definitely increasing pork consumption. When chicken's on sale, I think people are much more prone to be going for the sale items today. Same thing with fish. Market Basket, the fish counter is has very, very high ranges, and people are definitely going for the lesser cost fish items. So I don't think it's going to translate into less calories being consumed, but I certainly think people are sort of trading down.
Thanks very much. I wrote a paper about 15 years ago called Buy Chicken. And the reason that I wrote that is that was a time when grain prices were just going through the roof. And it seemed to me that when the input price goes up that much, you're going to have a change in the composition of consumption, just like higher gasoline prices shift people from Hummers to Prius. Higher grain prices should shift people from beef to pork down to chicken. Turned out that as I wrote that, there was another wave of consolidation in the meat industry, which I thought was very, very interesting. So there are huge, huge implications for industrial structure from these major changes of relative prices. Anything online? Nope, not at the moment. Anything else from the room? Yes, Bill. And maybe one more after that.
One comment and one question. In terms of the Japanese consumer, we now have 30% of the population over the age of 65 on a pretty horrible pension. They don't know how long they're going to live. So I don't think we're going to see a big uptake from at least that group of people, right? The question is regarding the transfer of land. I mean, if you inherit land, you can inherit the farming, but if you want to sell that to somebody else, it is still not possible in many cases. What is Japan going to do about that?
Maybe I should handle that one. There is something organized about 10 years ago, prefecture called agricultural land banks. And what's happened with these is that the owners of the land want to retire. They don't sell the land, but through the legal changes, they're able to lease it to people who can run a somewhat larger farm. And the Ministry of Agriculture has been pushing this. That's nice. Greg mentioned earlier that the average farm size outside Hokkaido now is 2.1 hectares, still tiny, but 10 years ago it was 1.75. So there is modest progress. I keep, promising a newspaper friend of mine that I want to publish an op-ed at some point saying Japan needs to reverse the MacArthur reforms. Here you had a very right-wing, GHQ that did the most, left-wing sort of thing of just taking land from the landlords and giving it out to individuals. It was immensely successful, but we're now still saddled with that in the political, and that has to change if we're going to get those economies of scale that Greg and others mentioned to get productivity of Japanese farming up. If we have just time, one more question over here. Was there another question? Yeah, very quickly. 30-second question, maybe a 30-second answer.
Aziz Ben Sultana, a full-time MBA and the CEO of Global Citizens Translation. I used to take food and the availability of food for granted until my favorite ice cream disappeared from the shelves in 2020 during COVID. During that period, I've seen a lot of issues with the supply because of the war in Ukraine at the moment with bread, regulatory issues and environments. Does Japan have any mechanisms in place to detect and proactively address these issues to prevent these disasters from happening before it's too late?
Haruka, any comments on that sort of preemptive action on agriculture supply?
Well, I guess it relates to also the domestic production of agricultural products potentially, encouraged to increase. But then I think, in the opening remarks, Greg and Keiko-san also highlighted how, it's going to take immense number of years to really materialize that. So then I think, it might be more of a political power, basically competition globally, which country can get hold of the commodities necessary. And that's where I think the global concern is rising, whether there will be enough food for everybody, and also the emerging economies or developing markets could also see even greater pinch, and threat to the lack of enough food, which I personally think we might not see in Japan necessarily, because
The answer is not much. Any other final comments, if I may, from either Keiko or Greg? Keiko, final comment?
Well, securing the food in sustainable, affordable way is big issue. But to do so, I think one way to do it is to leverage large corporation to improve the labor and capital productivity, period.
Okay. Greg, last word.
Yeah, I mean, the Japanese networks around the world, the assets that the Japanese companies own and operate, the alliances that Japan is part of, in my opinion, makes Japan not only food secure for the long term, but also in a very, very critical position to assist countries that are weaker and that do need the assistance of more sophisticated capabilities.
Thank you very much. Let me thank our panelists, Greg, Keiko, and Haruka, and thank everyone who has joined us today. And we look forward to a lot of more exciting news and business opportunities in the agriculture area. Thank you so much. Arigato.